The alarm in my chamber tore through the silence before dawn, and my first thought was that the palace was under attack. My second thought, the one that truly frightened me, was that my husband was not in bed beside me. My name is Velara Thesic, daughter of the Thesic Dominion, and I had been married for 6 months to a human named Daniel Hart. I threw on a robe and ran through the corridors with my guards trailing behind me, shouting questions they could not answer. When I reached the east balcony, I found him standing alone in the cold morning air, staring up at the sky with a stillness that did not belong to the man I thought I knew. "Daniel," I said, breathless, "what is happening?" He did not turn around right away. When he finally did, his eyes were calm in a way that made my skin prickle. Calm was not unusual for him. He was always calm, always soft-spoken, always the harmless human who apologized when he bumped into furniture. But this calm was different. This was the calm of a man who had been expecting bad news for a very long time and had finally received it. "Nothing is happening yet," he said. "Go back inside, please." I did not go back inside. I want to be honest about that, because everything that follows depends on you understanding that I am not the kind of woman who walks away from a mystery standing on her own balcony. I stayed, and I watched him watch the sky, and somewhere in that silence, I understood that my life was about to change in ways I could not yet imagine. To explain how I came to marry a human, I have to go back further, to the war that shaped everything about my people. The Thesic Dominion had ruled a modest stretch of stars for generations, proud and disciplined, until the Kralith Ascendancy decided our territory belonged to them instead. The war lasted 11 years. We lost 3 shipyards, 2 moons, and more soldiers than our historians like to count in public. By the time the humans arrived in our sector, flying ships nobody recognized and speaking a language nobody understood, my father's council was desperate enough to consider any alliance that might save us. The humans were strange. They did not look like warriors. They were soft-skinned, slow compared to us, and their ships, while advanced, did not carry themselves with the menace we expected from a species worth fearing. And yet something about the way their delegates spoke, carefully, without fear, without the usual posturing every other species used when negotiating with the Dominion, told my father this was a species that did not need to boast. The alliance was sealed the old way, the way my people have sealed important agreements for 1,000 years, a marriage. I was the second daughter, useful but not essential to the succession, and so I was offered as the bridge between our two peoples. I expected a soldier. I expected someone hard, proud, perhaps even cruel in the quiet way that powerful men often are. Instead, on the day of the ceremony, I was introduced to a man who tripped slightly on the steps of the altar and apologized to the priest for being late, even though he was not late at all. That was Daniel Hart. He was tall, for a human, with dark hair that never seemed properly combed and eyes the color of a certain kind of stone we have back home, gray with flecks of green. He smiled at me nervously during the ceremony, and when our hands were bound together in the traditional cloth, his fingers trembled slightly. I remember thinking, this is what they send me. This is the great human warrior my father was so afraid of offending. In the months that followed, my opinion did not improve. Daniel avoided the training grounds where my guards sparred each morning. He flinched, actually flinched, the first time he saw 2 of my honor guards practicing with blades, even though the blades were dulled for practice, and no one was in real danger. He refused invitations to the ritual combat trials that every noble family attended, claiming he did not enjoy watching people fight for sport, a strange sentiment for anyone raised among warriors. He spent his mornings in the palace gardens, of all places, learning the names of plants from the elderly groundskeeper, and his evenings writing long letters to people whose names I did not recognize. My court found him amusing. They called him, behind cupped hands but not quiet enough, my pet human. I did not correct them, not because I agreed, but because I could not think of a reason to defend a man who spent his days smelling flowers instead of learning the ways of my people. I told myself I did not care what they called him. I told myself a great many things during those early months that I would later have to unlearn. And yet, despite all of it, I found myself growing fond of him in a way I had not expected. He was kind, genuinely kind, not the performed kindness of nobles seeking favor, but something quieter and more constant. He listened when I spoke, really listened, the way almost no one in my position had ever listened to me. He asked questions about my people's history that showed he had actually studied it, not just memorized facts for diplomatic small talk, but tried to understand why we believed what we believed. When my mother died in the spring, unexpectedly, from a sickness the healers could not name in time, Daniel sat with me for 3 days, without saying very much at all, simply present, simply there, in a way that felt more valuable than any grand gesture. I began to think that perhaps this gentleness was not weakness after all, but a different kind of strength, one my people did not have a word for. I began to think, foolishly, that I understood him. The letters should have told me something was wrong. Daniel received them rarely, perhaps once a month, always through unusual channels that our palace communications officers found difficult to trace. He always read them alone, in his study, and he always burned the paper afterward, in a small dish he kept for that purpose. When I asked him about them, early in our marriage, he told me they were from old friends back home, people he had served with before he became a diplomat. I accepted this answer, because I had no reason not to. I was young, and I was lonely in my grief, and I wanted to believe the simple story more than I wanted to question it. It was 3 weeks before the morning on the balcony that the first crack appeared in that simple story. A courier arrived at the palace gates, carrying an encrypted transmission addressed specifically to Daniel, not through the usual diplomatic channels, but through a private frequency that our intelligence officers did not recognize. My chief of security, a stern woman named Kessa who had served my family for 2 decades, brought the matter to me personally rather than to Daniel, because the transmission had triggered a flag in our monitoring systems that she did not fully understand. "It is a single sentence, Your Highness," Kessa told me, standing rigid in my private study, with the decrypted message displayed on a data slate between us. The translation software struggled with some of the phrasing, but the core message is clear enough. I read it myself. The words were simple, almost plain, and that plainness made them worse somehow than any elaborate threat could have been. "I have not forgotten what you did, and soon neither will they." I did not know who they referred to. I did not know who had sent it, or why, or what Daniel had supposedly done that required forgetting or remembering. What I knew was that when I showed the message to Daniel that evening, in the quiet of our private chambers, something in his face changed that I had never seen before. He went very still. His breathing slowed, deliberately, the way a person breathes when they are forcing themselves to remain calm rather than actually feeling calm. He read the message twice, then set the data slate down on the table between us, with exaggerated gentleness, as though it might shatter, or as though he did not trust his hands to move any faster than that. "Where did this come from?" he asked, and his voice was different too. Lower, steadier. All the softness I had grown used to had folded itself away somewhere I could not see. "Kessa's team is still tracing the origin point," I said. "Daniel, who is this from? What does it mean?" He did not answer right away. He walked to the window of our chamber and looked out at the palace grounds, the same grounds where he had spent so many quiet mornings among the flowers, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured, the words of a man choosing exactly how much truth to share and how much to keep locked away. "It's someone I used to know," he said, "before I came here, before any of this. You told me you were a diplomat's aide before we married. I told you a version of the truth," he said, and even that small admission felt like watching a door open onto a room I had not known existed inside my own home. "I need you to trust me on this, Valera. I need you to let me handle it quietly, without involving your council, without alarming your people. Can you do that?" I should have pressed him further that night. I have thought about this many times since, turned it over in my mind, the way one turns over a stone, looking for what might be hiding underneath. But I looked at his face, and I saw something there that frightened me more than any answer he might have given, a kind of grief, mixed with dread, the expression of a man who has spent a long time trying to outrun something and has just discovered it caught up to him anyway. So instead of pressing him, I did something that surprised even me. I agreed to trust him, and I asked Kessa to double the exterior watch on the palace, without explaining why, and I told myself that whatever this was, it would pass, the way most shadows pass when enough time goes by. It did not pass. Over the following days, Daniel changed in small ways that anyone who knew him well would have noticed immediately. He stopped visiting the gardens in the mornings. He began waking before dawn and walking the perimeter of the palace grounds alone, always with a particular kind of attention in his eyes that reminded me of the way my own guards watched a room, cataloging exits and threats without seeming to think about it at all. He asked Kessa detailed questions about our defense systems, questions that were oddly specific for a man who claimed to have no military background, questions about response times and blind spots, and the range of our perimeter sensors. Kessa mentioned this to me privately, her voice carrying the particular caution of a soldier who has noticed something professionally unusual in a person she had previously dismissed as harmless. "Your husband asks questions like someone who has commanded a defense before, Your Highness," she said. "I do not say this to alarm you. I say it because I think you should know. I did not know what to do with that information, so for a time, I simply carried it, the way one carries a stone in a pocket, aware of its weight, without quite deciding what it means. I watched Daniel more closely after that. I noticed the way he stood slightly differently now, weight balanced, shoulders set, as though his body remembered something his manner had spent months trying to forget. I noticed the way his eyes moved across a room when we entered it together, quick and thorough, before settling back into their familiar softness for my benefit. One evening, about a week after the message arrived, I found him in his study long after the palace had gone quiet, sitting at his desk with an old datapad open in front of him, its screen showing an image I could not quite see from the doorway. He did not hear me approach, which was unusual for a man who had recently become so alert to his surroundings, and when I stepped closer, I saw what held his attention. It was a photograph, worn with age and handling, of a group of humans, in some kind of uniform, standing together in front of a ship I did not recognize. Daniel was among them, younger, harder around the eyes, standing slightly apart from the others, in a way that suggested rank rather than distance. "Who are they?" I asked quietly, and this time he did not startle. He simply looked up at me with an expression of tired resignation, as though he had known this conversation was coming and had simply been waiting for the right moment, or perhaps had given up hoping there would ever be a right moment at all. "People I served with," he said, "a long time ago now, before I asked to be reassigned somewhere quiet, somewhere I thought no one would ever need to find me again. And the message, the person who sent it, are they one of these people?" Daniel closed the datapad slowly, and when he looked at me again, there was something in his expression that I had never seen from him before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of weary certainty, the look of a man who has finally accepted that a reckoning he has been avoiding is no longer avoidable. "His name is Vane," he said, "and if he is coming here, then I need you to understand something about me that I have spent the last 6 months trying very hard to keep you from ever having to learn." He did not finish the thought that night. A courier interrupted us, breathless from running, carrying word that had just reached the palace's outer sensor network, word of an unregistered vessel that had appeared at the edge of our system without warning, without identification, without any of the courtesies that ships were expected to observe when entering Dominion space. I looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked back at me, and in his eyes, I saw the last of the harmless husband I thought I had married quietly step aside, making room for whoever, or whatever, had been waiting patiently underneath him all along. "That's him," Daniel said softly. "That's Vane." And that is how, on an otherwise ordinary morning 6 months into my marriage, I found myself standing on a palace balcony, beside a man I no longer fully recognized, watching the sky for the arrival of a ship that would change everything I thought I understood about the quiet, gentle husband my father had chosen for me, and about the strange, restrained species that had sent him. I did not know yet how much I did not know. I would learn, in the days that followed, that the man I had spent months underestimating carried within him something my people had no proper word for, something that made even Kessa, hardened by decades of service, go pale when she finally understood what she was looking at. I would learn that the letters he burned so carefully were not from old friends catching up on old times, but warnings, each one a countdown toward a reckoning he had been trying to prevent from ever reaching my doorstep. But that morning, all I knew was the cold air on the balcony, the stillness in my husband's shoulders, and the terrible, growing certainty that whatever arrived in our sky within the hour would answer the questions I had been too comfortable, too content, too willing to leave unasked. The sky brightened slowly, indifferent to the fear building beneath it. Somewhere far above the clouds, a single unmarked ship began its descent toward our world, and somewhere inside my own chest, a quiet, creeping dread began its descent as well, the dawning understanding that harmless was a word I had chosen for my husband without ever truly earning the right to use it. The ship did not land the way I expected an enemy vessel to land. There was no bombardment, no warning shots across our defense grid, no signal demanding surrender. It simply descended through the atmosphere with a kind of unhurried confidence that I found more unsettling than any show of force could have been, settling onto the open field beyond the palace's outer wall, as though it had been invited, as though its pilot had never once considered that anyone here might try to stop him. Kessa mobilized every guard we had within minutes. I watched from the command tower as rows of Dominion soldiers formed a perimeter around the field, weapons raised, formations tight and disciplined, everything my people had trained for across generations of conflict. Daniel stood beside me at the tower window, silent, his eyes fixed on the ship with an intensity that made the hair on my arms rise. "Tell them to stand down," he said quietly. "Stand down," I repeated, certain I had misheard him. "Daniel, that ship carries a man who threatened you directly. My guards are here to protect this palace." "Your guards are here to die if Vane decides they should," he said, and the flatness in his voice was worse than any shout could have been. "Please, Velara, I am asking you to trust me one more time. Pull them back to the wall. Let me go out there alone." I refused, of course. What kind of wife would let her husband walk alone toward an unknown enemy, without so much as an honor guard beside him? I ordered Kessa to accompany him with a full unit, and I insisted on coming myself, over Daniel's protests, over Kessa's protests, over what felt like the protests of the entire palace. In the end, they relented, because I was the princess, and because arguing with me wasted time we did not have. We walked out through the palace gates together, a formation of 30 armed guards, myself and Daniel, who wore no armor, carried no visible weapon, and moved with a calm that seemed to unsettle even Kessa's most hardened soldiers more than any display of nervousness would have. The ship's ramp lowered when we were still 50 paces away. A single figure emerged, unhurried, hands loose at his sides, and began walking toward us across the open field. He was human, tall, broad through the shoulders, with cropped gray hair and a scar that ran from his temple down through one eyebrow. He wore no uniform I recognized, only a plain dark coat, and he carried himself the way certain predators move through open ground, aware of every eye on him and entirely unconcerned by the attention. "Daniel Hart," the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "You've gotten soft. Gardens, was it? Someone told me you'd taken up gardens." "Vane," Daniel said, and stopped walking, holding up a hand to stop the rest of us as well. "You shouldn't have come here." "I gave you 6 months," Vane said, still walking closer, close enough now that I could see the coldness in his pale eyes, a coldness that made my skin crawl in a way none of our own history's tyrants had ever managed. 6 months to answer my letters, 6 months to explain yourself. You spent them planting flowers instead." "This has nothing to do with them," Daniel said, gesturing slightly toward myself and the assembled guards without turning to look at us. "Whatever is between us, Vane, it stays between us. These people have no part in it." Vane laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You married their princess, Daniel. You made it their business the moment you signed that contract." His eyes shifted past Daniel, finding me directly, and something about the way he looked at me, assessing, cataloging, made me understand for the first time that this man had not traveled across the stars merely to exchange harsh words with an old comrade. "Does she know what you did? Does she know why the coalition really let you retire so quietly, so far from anyone who might ask questions?" "That's enough," Daniel said, and his voice had changed again, dropping into that low, level register I had heard only once before, on the night he told me his name. Kessa's hand moved to the weapon at her hip, and I saw a dozen other guards mirror the motion, and for one terrible moment, I believed we stood on the edge of a confrontation that would end with bodies on this field before the sun had fully risen. But Vane simply raised both hands, palms open, an almost mocking gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to fight your toy soldiers," he said. "I came to talk. Just talk, Daniel. One conversation, and then I'll decide whether I still need to finish what I started." Daniel glanced back at me then, and in his eyes I saw a plea I had never seen from him before. A request, not for permission, but for understanding. An unspoken apology for everything he had not yet told me, and everything he was about to. "Give us the field," he said. "Please. I will explain everything to you afterward, I promise you that, but I need you to trust me for a little longer." I did not want to grant that request. Every instinct trained into me since childhood told me never to leave a threat unwatched, never to give ground to an enemy simply because he asked politely. But something in Daniel's face, some old and buried certainty, convinced me that this was a conversation that could not happen with an audience, that whatever history existed between these two men belonged to a chapter of my husband's life that he needed to close on his own terms before he could open it fully to me. I ordered the guards back to the wall. I went with them, though I stopped at the very edge of hearing range, close enough to watch, far enough to grant the illusion of privacy. Kessa stayed beside me, tense as a drawn bowstring, her hand never leaving her weapon. I could not hear every word exchanged on that field, but I watched the shape of the conversation unfold in gestures and posture. Vane spoke at length, pacing slightly, his hands moving in sharp, accusing motions. Daniel stood mostly still, absorbing whatever was said, his own hands clasped loosely behind his back, in a posture of forced patience. At one point, Vane's voice rose enough that fragments carried across the field to us, words like colony and campaign, and "you left me there," delivered with a bitterness that sounded almost personal, almost wounded, beneath its hostility. "Your Highness," Kessa murmured beside me, "I do not like this. I do not like not knowing what is being discussed regarding the safety of the crown." "Neither do I admitted. "But I think, whatever this is, it began long before either of us entered his life. I think we are watching the end of a story that started somewhere else entirely." But the conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt considerably longer standing there in the cold morning air, watching my husband's shoulders grow more rigid with every passing exchange. Finally, Vane said something that made Daniel go very still in the particular way I now recognized as the moment before something dangerous, and then Vane turned and walked back toward his ship without another word, without so much as a backward glance, as though the entire confrontation had simply run its course and no longer interested him. Daniel did not move until the ship's ramp had fully closed. Only then did he turn and walk back toward us, his expression unreadable, his gait steady, but somehow heavier than it had been an hour before. "He is leaving," Kessa said, watching the vessel's engines begin to hum with building power. "Should we intercept?" "No," Daniel said, close enough now to answer for himself. "Let him go. He will be back." This was never going to end with one conversation. I searched his face for answers, and found only exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a man who has just been forced to remember things he worked very hard to forget. "Daniel," I said, "you promised me an explanation." "I know," he said, "and I will give you one. Not here, not in front of your guards. Please, come inside with me." We walked back through the palace gates in silence, the ship's engines roaring to life behind us, and climbing away into the brightening sky, leaving behind nothing but a scorched patch of field, and a question that had been building in me for weeks, one I could no longer avoid asking directly. Once we reached the privacy of our chambers, Kessa posted outside the door despite Daniel's quiet protest. I finally turned to face him fully. "Tell me who you were before you came here," I said. "Tell me everything, Daniel." "I am done accepting half of your story." He sat down slowly on the edge of our bed, and for a long moment, he simply stared at his own hands, turning them over as though inspecting them for some old stain that refused to wash away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the softness I had grown accustomed to over the past 6 months. It carried instead the weight of a confession long overdue. "Before I came here," he said, "I was not a diplomat's aide. I commanded a unit called the Long Reach, part of a human military response to a conflict on the far edge of our own explored space, a conflict most of your people have never even heard of because it happened before we ever made contact with the Dominion. Vane served under me. He was talented, ambitious, and eventually he became something I could not control, something that turned a legitimate campaign into a series of actions I am not proud of having allowed to happen under my command. What kind of actions? I asked, though some part of me already suspected I did not want the full answer. The kind that ended with my resignation, a classified inquiry, and a quiet reassignment as far from human military command as the coalition could arrange, Daniel said. I asked for this posting, Velara. I asked to be sent somewhere. I would never have to make that kind of decision again. I did not choose this marriage only for the alliance. I chose it because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that I could finally become the kind of man I always wanted to be, instead of the kind of man that conflict forced me into becoming. I sat down beside him, my anger softening slowly into something more complicated, a tangled mixture of sympathy and unease that I did not fully know how to name. And, Vane, I said, what does he want from you now? Daniel looked up at me then, and in his eyes I saw the first real fear I had witnessed from him since this entire ordeal began. Not fear of Vane himself, but fear of what he might have to become in order to stop him. He wants what he has always wanted, Daniel said quietly. He wants me to finish what I started all those years ago, and if I refuse him again, Velara, he is not going to limit his next visit to conversation. Outside our window, the sky had fully cleared, the morning sun climbing steadily toward noon, indifferent to the quiet dread settling over our chambers like a fog that refused to burn away. I did not yet understand the full scope of what was coming, but I understood, with a certainty that chilled me far more than the cold morning air had, that the man I had once dismissed as harmless carried within him a history capable of shaking my entire world to its foundations, and that Vane's ship, however peacefully it had departed, would not stay away for long. 3 days passed after Vane's departure, and in those 3 days I watched my husband transform into someone I barely recognized. Though I could not have said exactly what was changing, only that the changes were there, small and persistent, like frost creeping across a window pane overnight. He stopped sleeping through the night. I would wake in the darkness to find his side of the bed empty, and I would find him in his study, poring over old files on a secure datapad that had somehow appeared in our chambers without my noticing its arrival. Files marked with classifications I did not recognize, symbols and codes that belonged to a military structure far removed from anything my people used. He spoke less during meals, answered my questions with careful, measured responses that felt increasingly rehearsed, as though he were choosing each word with the precision of a man diffusing something volatile. Kessa came to me on the second day, her expression carrying the particular grimness of a soldier delivering news she did not want to deliver. Your Highness, she said, I took the liberty of running a deeper background inquiry through our intelligence contacts within the human coalition. I hope you will forgive the presumption. What did you find? I asked, though something in her posture told me the answer would not comfort me. Very little, she admitted, and that is precisely what troubles me. Most records regarding your husband's military service before his diplomatic posting have been sealed under classifications our systems cannot penetrate, even with the cooperation of our human contacts. What little I did find suggests he commanded a unit involved in what their own records refer to only as an incident, followed immediately by his resignation and reassignment. The man who sent that ship, this Vane, his records are sealed even more thoroughly. Whatever happened between them, Your Highness, the humans themselves do not want it discussed. I absorbed this information the way one absorbs a blow expected but still painful when it finally lands. Thank you, Kessa, I said. Please continue your inquiries quietly. I do not want this becoming a matter for the full council yet. Understood, she said, then hesitated at the door. Your Highness, may I speak candidly? Always. I have served your family for 20 years, Kessa said. I have seen soldiers of every temperament pass through these halls, warriors who bragged about their conquests, and warriors who never spoke of the battles they had survived. In my experience, the ones who never speak are almost always the ones who saw the worst of it. I do not say this to frighten you further. I say it because I think your husband's silence has never been weakness, and I believe you are beginning to understand that yourself. I thought about her words long after she had gone, turning them over as I had turned over so many other fragments of understanding these past weeks. That evening, I found Daniel in the garden, of all places, standing among the same flowers he used to tend so carefully each morning, before Vane's shadow fell across our lives. He was not tending them now. He was simply standing there, looking at them with an expression of quiet grief, as though mourning something that had already been lost, even though the flowers themselves remained perfectly intact. "You used to come out here every morning," I said, joining him among the rows of blossoms that the elderly groundskeeper had taught him to identify by name. "I did," he agreed. "I liked it, because nothing here demands anything of you, except attention and patience. No orders. No consequences beyond a wilted petal if you forget to water something. I think I needed that, after everything." He paused, running a finger gently along the edge of a leaf. "I am afraid I will not have much time for gardens anymore, Velara. Not until this is finished." "Tell me what happened," I said. "Not the summary you gave me before. All of it. I cannot help you carry this if I do not understand its full weight." He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought perhaps he would deflect again, retreat into vague generalities the way he had every time this subject arose. Instead, he sat down on the low garden bench, and after a moment I sat beside him, and he finally began to speak in a voice stripped of all its usual gentleness, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "The Long Reach was sent to secure 3 colony worlds during a conflict most of your people never heard about," he said. "The enemy we faced was not like your Kralith. They were smaller in number, but ruthless in tactics, willing to use civilian populations as cover, as leverage, as shields. My orders were to secure the colonies with minimal casualties on both sides. Vane believed minimal casualties was a weakness that would get our own people killed. He was not entirely wrong about the risks. He was entirely wrong about what he did in response." "What did he do?" I asked quietly. "He took matters into his own hands during an operation on the 3rd colony," Daniel said. "He believed decisive, overwhelming action would end the conflict faster and save more lives in the long run than my more careful approach. He was given authority over a portion of my forces during a critical engagement, and he used that authority to conduct an operation I had explicitly forbidden. The result ended the immediate conflict, yes. It also cost us something we could never fully account for afterward, and it cost the people we were supposed to be protecting far more than the enemy ever had." I did not press him for the exact details of what that operation entailed. Something in his voice told me the specifics were not the point, that the wound he carried was less about the precise events and more about the guilt of command, the burden of having been responsible for a subordinate whose actions he could not control and could never fully forgive himself for allowing. "I relieved him of command the moment I learned what he had done," Daniel continued. "I reported everything to the Coalition Oversight Board, testified against him personally, and watched him stripped of rank and quietly discharged, rather than face the full consequences his actions deserved, because the Coalition decided a public trial would cause more damage to morale than it was worth. I resigned my own commission not long after. I could not, in good conscience, continue commanding others after failing so completely to prevent what happened under my watch. I asked for reassignment somewhere far away, somewhere quiet, and eventually that request led me here, to your father's court, and eventually to you." "And Vane blames you for his discharge," I said slowly, piecing together the shape of the grievance that had followed my husband across the stars. "He believes you betrayed him." "He believes I owe him a debt," Daniel said. "He has spent years since then building something of his own, outside Coalition oversight, a group of former soldiers who share his particular philosophy about decisive action and acceptable losses. Each letter he has sent me over these past months has asked, in various ways, for me to join him, to finally admit that his methods were the correct ones, that my restraint, all those years ago, was the true failure. I have refused every time. This visit was his way of telling me that his patience has run out." "What happens now?" I asked, though part of me already feared the answer. Daniel looked at me then, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I saw something other than fear or grief in his eyes. I saw resolve, quiet and absolute, settling over his features like the last piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "Now I have to decide whether I am willing to become, one final time, the person I swore I would never be again," he said. "Because Vane will not stop asking politely. His next visit will not be a conversation." That night, I found sleep elusive, my mind circling endlessly around everything Daniel had revealed. Somewhere in the small hours, I gave up trying and instead went looking for him, only to find his side of the bed empty once more. This time, I did not find him in his study. I found him in the palace's lower archive chamber, a room rarely used except by scholars researching ancient Dominion history, and he was not alone. Kessa stood with him, along with two of her most trusted officers, gathered around a holographic display showing what appeared to be tactical schematics, defense grids, and projected timelines. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unnoticed, listening to fragments of their conversation, words like perimeter breach, and response window, and containment protocol, spoken in Daniel's voice, with a fluency and authority that startled me more than anything else had in recent days. This was not the hesitant, apologetic man who had tripped on the steps of our wedding altar. This was someone else entirely, someone who spoke the language of defense and strategy as naturally as he had once spoken the language of gardens and flowers. "Your Highness," Kessa said, noticing me at last, and the others fell silent, turning toward me with expressions caught somewhere between guilt and relief. "What is this?" I asked, stepping into the room, my eyes moving across the holographic display, taking in details I only partially understood. "Daniel, what are you planning?" He straightened, and for a moment, I thought he might retreat back into his old habit of softening the truth for my benefit. Instead, he met my gaze directly, and I saw in his expression the last remnants of the careful distance he had tried to maintain between his old life and our new one finally begin to dissolve. "I am planning to make certain that when Vane returns, and he will return, your people are not caught unprepared, the way they nearly were 3 days ago," he said. "I am planning to use everything I know, everything I spent years trying to forget I knew, to protect this palace and everyone in it. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner, Velara. I was trying to protect you from a part of my past I hoped you would never need to see." I looked around the room at the assembled officers, at Kessa's expression of grudging, growing respect, at the tactical displays that suggested a mind far more strategically capable than any diplomat's aide had any right to possess, and I felt the last fragments of the man I thought I had married settle quietly into place, alongside a version of him I was only now beginning to understand. "Then let me help," I said. "Whatever is coming, Daniel, we face it together. I am done being protected from the truth of my own husband." He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face, and then, slowly, he nodded and gestured for me to join him at the display, and began, for the first time since our marriage began, to show me exactly who he truly was. The days that followed became a strange blur of preparation, the palace transforming quietly around us into something closer to a fortress, though we took great care to keep the transformation hidden from the wider court, who still believed my gentle human husband spent his mornings among the flowers rather than redesigning our entire defense strategy from the ground up. Daniel worked with Kessa and her officers late into every night, reviewing our perimeter systems, our response protocols, and the layout of the palace itself, with an analytical precision that left even the most experienced Dominion tacticians impressed despite themselves. I sat in on these sessions whenever I could, absorbing a version of my husband I had never been permitted to see before, watching him identify weaknesses in defenses my people had trusted for generations without ever questioning them. "Your perimeter sensors have a rotation gap here," he said one evening, pointing to a section of the holographic display that mapped the palace grounds. "Every 90 seconds, there is a 4-second window where this quadrant goes unmonitored. It is a small gap, but Vane will find it if he looks, because finding gaps like this is exactly the kind of thing he trained himself to do." Kessa studied the display with a frown. "That gap has existed since before I was assigned to palace security. No one has ever exploited it. No one who has tried has had Vane's particular skill set," Daniel said. "I am not saying this to criticize your systems, Kessa. I am saying it because I need you to understand the kind of opponent we are dealing with. He does not attack the strongest point of a defense. He finds the smallest weakness and turns it into an opening large enough to walk an army through." I watched Kessa's expression shift from defensive pride to genuine respect over the course of these sessions, watched her soldiers begin to treat Daniel not as the princess's harmless human husband, but as someone whose judgment they trusted implicitly, someone whose past, however mysterious, clearly included expertise they desperately needed now. It was a strange thing, watching my husband earn the respect of my people not through gentleness, but through a competence he had spent our entire marriage carefully hiding from view. On the fourth night after Vane's departure, Daniel finally told me the fuller shape of his plan, laying it out with the same careful precision he applied to everything else since the mask had come off. "Vane will not attack the palace directly," he said, as we sat together in our chambers, the rest of the household finally asleep around us. "That would be too obvious, too easy to defend against. Once we know he is capable of finding weaknesses, he will try something more indirect first, testing our responses, probing for information, perhaps even attempting to turn some of your own people against us before he commits to a direct confrontation." "How can you be certain?" I asked. "Because I trained him," Daniel said simply. "Every tactic he uses, every strategy he employs, I taught him most of it myself, back when he was still a soldier I trusted rather than an enemy I have to anticipate. It is a strange kind of advantage, knowing your opponent's mind so intimately. It is also a strange kind of burden." I reached for his hand, and for a moment the careful distance between the gentle husband I had known and the capable strategist he had become seemed to dissolve entirely, leaving only Daniel, tired and burdened but present, choosing to let me see all of him, rather than the carefully curated fragments he had offered before. "You did not choose this, Daniel," I said. "None of this is your fault." "Some of it is," he said quietly. "I trained him. I trusted him with authority. He was not ready to hold responsibly. Whatever guilt I carry for what happened on that colony, some portion of it will always belong to me, no matter how many years pass, or how many gardens I tend in the meantime." He paused, turning to face me fully. "But you are right about one thing. What happens next, whatever Vane chooses to do, that choice belongs entirely to him. I have spent years trying to atone for a mistake that was never fully mine to atone for. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life doing the same." It was, I think, in that moment that I first began to understand the true shape of the man I had married, not the harmless human my father's counsel had offered as a political convenience, and not merely the hardened soldier Vane's arrival had revealed either, but something more complicated than either extreme. A man who had lived through genuine failure and genuine guilt, and had chosen, deliberately and with enormous effort, to build a gentler version of himself in the aftermath, even knowing that the old capabilities never truly left him, only waited, quietly, for a moment when they might be needed again. 5 days after Vane's ship first appeared in our skies, our monitoring systems detected the first sign of his return, though not in the way any of us expected. It began not with a ship on our sensors, but with a security breach in the palace's lower communications hub, an intrusion so subtle that our systems nearly failed to flag it at all, catching it only because Daniel had personally reconfigured the monitoring protocols 3 days earlier, adding safeguards specifically designed to catch exactly this kind of infiltration. "Someone is accessing our internal network," Kessa reported, rushing into the strategy room where Daniel and I had been reviewing the latest defense schematics. The intrusion originated from within the palace grounds itself, not from an external transmission. Daniel's expression hardened instantly. "He has someone on the inside," he said. "That is exactly the kind of indirect approach I warned you about. Kessa, I need a full lockdown of every communications terminal immediately, and I need to know every member of staff who has accessed the lower hub within the past week." The following hours passed in tense, methodical investigation, Kessa's security teams sweeping through the palace with an efficiency that spoke to genuine professional pride, cross-referencing access logs, questioning staff members, tracing the digital footprint of the intrusion back through layer after layer of obscured routing. It was Daniel, ultimately, who identified the source, tracing a pattern in the intrusion's methodology that matched techniques he recognized from his own years of training soldiers under Vane's former command. "It's Corvin," he said finally, staring at a name that had surfaced from the access logs, a junior member of the palace's technical staff who had been employed for less than a year. "I do not know this specific person, but this technique, this exact pattern of misdirection, it belongs to someone trained in Vane's methods. He must have planted an agent here weeks ago, long before his first visit, preparing this option in case direct negotiation failed. Corvin was located within the hour, apprehended quietly in the palace's lower levels before he could complete whatever task Vane had assigned him. Under Kessa's careful questioning, conducted with a professionalism that avoided any hint of cruelty despite the gravity of the betrayal, the young technician eventually admitted he had been recruited months earlier, through promises of wealth and position within Vane's growing organization, tasked with quietly mapping the palace's internal systems and, when the moment came, disabling key defense protocols from the inside. He was supposed to signal readiness once the internal systems were compromised, Corvin admitted, his earlier bravado collapsing entirely under the weight of what he had nearly participated in. I do not know what happens after that signal is sent. I was never told the full plan. I was only ever given my piece of it. Daniel absorbed this information with a grim, focused calm that I had come to recognize as the particular expression he wore when processing something dangerous. That is exactly how Vane operates, he said, once Corvin had been secured under guard, and we were alone again in the strategy room. He compartmentalizes everything, ensures no single piece of his plan can be fully understood by any one person who might betray it. Whatever the internal systems were meant to disable, it was likely something specific, something he needs neutralized before he risks a direct approach. Our primary defense grid, Kessa said grimly, having rejoined us after securing the prisoner. If the internal systems were compromised as planned, our perimeter shields and automated response systems would have gone offline at whatever moment he chose to send that signal. We would have been left with nothing but conventional guards against whatever force he intends to bring. The weight of how close we had come to that vulnerability settled heavily over the room. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, and I saw the same expression of controlled guilt I had witnessed in the garden days earlier. The burden of a man who understood his enemy's methods intimately enough to anticipate them, and who felt every near miss as a personal failure, regardless of how successfully it had ultimately been prevented. We were fortunate, he said finally, fortunate and prepared, because we expected something like this. But Vane will know this attempt failed soon enough, if he does not already. And when he realizes his indirect approach has been discovered, he will not waste more time on subtlety. What will he do instead? I asked, though some part of me had already begun to suspect the answer, watching it form in Daniel's expression, before he even spoke the words aloud. He will come himself, Daniel said quietly, looking toward the window, toward the darkening sky beyond it, as though he could already feel the weight of an approaching storm, gathering somewhere just beyond our sight. And this time, Velara, he will not be interested in conversation. Vane's second arrival came without warning, exactly as Daniel had predicted, though the manner of it still managed to catch us slightly off guard. There was no single ship this time, no lone vessel descending politely onto an open field. Instead, our outer sensor network detected a coordinated deployment of 6 smaller craft entering the atmosphere simultaneously from different vectors, spreading out across our airspace in a pattern clearly designed to divide our attention and overwhelm our response capacity. He learned from our defenses last time, Kessa said grimly, watching the tactical display fill with hostile contacts. He is testing every quadrant at once, looking for the response he cannot predict. Do not let him find it, Daniel said, his voice carrying the calm, immediate authority I had grown accustomed to over the past week. Kessa, deploy your teams according to the contingency plan we drafted. Do not engage unless engaged first. I want every unit holding position, not chasing after shadows. The palace descended into a state of controlled, disciplined tension, guards moving into their assigned positions with the practiced efficiency Daniel's training had instilled over the previous days. While overhead, the 6 craft continued their slow, deliberate approach, never quite entering weapons range, never quite retreating either, simply circling closer with each pass like predators testing the boundaries of a den before committing to an attack. I stood beside Daniel in the command tower, watching the display with a growing knot of dread in my chest, and I noticed something in his posture that troubled me more than the approaching ships themselves. He was watching not the tactical display, but a separate feed. A single frequency he had isolated from the rest of the communications traffic, waiting for something specific. What are you expecting? I asked quietly. Him, Daniel said. This display of force, it is not the real attack. It is theater, meant to occupy Kessa's attention while Vane makes his actual move somewhere quieter. He would not risk his own presence on something as blunt as an aerial assault against a fortified position. He is more patient than that, more precise. As though summoned by Daniel's words, a new signal appeared on the isolated frequency, a private transmission addressed directly and only to him, bypassing every layer of palace security we had established. Daniel accepted it, and Vane's voice filled the small chamber, calm, almost conversational, utterly untroubled by the 6 ships currently circling overhead, as a distraction of his own design. "You found Corvin faster than I expected," Vane said. "I am almost impressed, Daniel. Almost. Tell me, did the years among these people teach you something new, or did you simply remember who you used to be?"
"Call off your ships, Vane," Daniel said. "This does not need to end the way you are planning for it to end."
"It has needed to end this way since the day you testified against me," Vane replied, and for the first time, I heard something raw beneath his cold composure, an old wound that had clearly never fully healed. "You had the chance to stand beside your own officer, Daniel. You had the chance to explain to the board that difficult decisions in difficult moments do not always look clean from the outside. Instead, you chose your reputation over my career, and I have spent every year since then reminding myself exactly why that choice deserves an answer." "I chose accountability," Daniel said. "What you did on that colony was not a difficult decision made in a difficult moment. It was a choice you made, knowing exactly what it would cost, and you made it anyway, because you believed the cost was acceptable, as long as someone else paid it." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the transmission had failed. When Vane finally spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier composure entirely, replaced by something sharper, angrier, the voice of a man finally allowing an old grievance to surface without restraint. "Then let us discover together whether your restraint remains as principled now as it was then," Vane said. "I am not interested in destroying your little palace, Daniel. I am interested in you. Meet me at the ridge beyond your eastern boundary, alone, unarmed if you have the courage for it, and I will call my ships back the moment you arrive. Refuse, and I promise you, this palace will learn exactly what my patience running out actually looks like." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the chamber in tense silence. I turned to Daniel, already knowing what he intended, before he spoke it aloud, and feeling every instinct in my body rebel against the thought of allowing it. "You cannot go alone," I said immediately. "Daniel, this is exactly the kind of trap you warned Kessa about. He is drawing you away from your defenses, isolating you exactly the way he isolates every weakness he finds." "I know," Daniel said quietly, "and I am going anyway, because the alternative is letting those 6 ships find a reason to test your defenses in ways none of us can fully predict. Vane's grievance has never truly been with your people, Valara. It has always been with me. If I can end this on that ridge, quietly, personally, then your people never have to pay the price of a conflict that was never truly theirs to inherit. And if you cannot end it," I said, my voice breaking slightly despite my best effort to remain composed, "what happens then?" Daniel turned to face me fully, and in his expression I saw none of the fear I expected, only a kind of resolved, quiet sadness, the expression of a man who had made peace, however reluctantly, with the possibility of an outcome he did not want, but understood he might not be able to avoid. "Then Kessa follows the contingency plan we built together," he said. "And you survive this, Valara. Whatever else happens, that is the only outcome I am unwilling to negotiate." I wanted to argue further, wanted to insist on accompanying him despite every reason he could offer against it, but Kessa's voice interrupted us, urgent and controlled, reporting that the 6 ships had begun a new formation, spreading wider across our perimeter, as though preparing for a coordinated strike should Vane's demand go unanswered. The decision, however much I wanted to resist it, had effectively already been made for us by the ticking clock of Vane's patience. "I am coming to the boundary with you," I said finally, refusing to be entirely dismissed from this decision even as I accepted the shape of it. "Not to the ridge itself, but close enough that I am not simply waiting here helplessly while you walk toward whatever he has planned." Daniel studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened slightly, a flicker of the gentle husband I had first underestimated resurfacing briefly beneath the hardened resolve of the soldier he had become again. "All right," he said, "close enough to watch. No closer than that, please." We rode out together toward the eastern boundary, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Kessa and a full unit of guards accompanying us as far as the boundary line itself, though Daniel insisted, and I eventually agreed, that they hold position there, rather than following him further toward the ridge where Vane waited. The ridge itself rose gently above the surrounding grassland, a natural formation that offered clear visibility in every direction, the kind of location a careful tactician would choose, specifically because it offered no easy opportunity for ambush or surprise, a place where any confrontation would happen in the open, witnessed by nothing but sky and stone. I watched from the boundary line as Daniel climbed the ridge alone, his figure growing smaller against the darkening horizon, and I watched Vane emerge from the shadow of a rock formation near the ridge's summit to meet him, the two men coming together at last in the place Vane had chosen, for whatever reckoning he believed he was owed. I could not hear their words from that distance, but I did not need to. I understood, watching the tension in both men's postures, watching Vane's hands moving in sharp, angry gestures while Daniel remained still and steady in response, that this was the final act of a story that had begun long before I entered either man's life, a story of trust broken and guilt carried, and a debt that had finally come due after years of careful avoidance. Beside me, Kessa kept her eyes fixed on the 6 ships still circling overhead, her hand never leaving her weapon, her soldiers arranged in careful readiness behind us, should the confrontation on the ridge resolve itself in a direction that demanded further response. "Whatever happens up there," Kessa said quietly, without taking her eyes off the sky, "your husband chose to face it alone rather than risk a single life under your command. Your Highness, I have served many nobles in my years of duty. I have rarely seen that particular kind of courage from anyone born into privilege, let alone from someone your father's council once dismissed as harmless." I did not answer her, because I could not find words adequate to the swelling mixture of pride and terror building in my chest as I watched the two figures on the ridge, unable to look away, unable to do anything but wait, and hope that whatever history bound them together would finally, mercifully, find its resolution before the sun fully set beneath the horizon. On the ridge, Vane circled slowly, his earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by something raw and restless that even I could sense from a distance. Daniel stood his ground, unmoving, watching his former officer with the patient, careful attention of a man who understood that the true danger of this moment lay not in any physical confrontation, but in the years of grievance finally boiling over into something neither of them could easily contain. "You still think you can talk your way out of this," Vane said, his voice carrying faintly on the evening wind toward where I stood at the boundary line. "You always believed words were enough, Daniel. Enough to justify abandoning your own people. Enough to convince a board of officers who never once set foot on that colony that you understood something they did not." "I never claimed to understand everything," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the accusation. "I only understood that what you did could not be allowed to stand unanswered, no matter how difficult the alternative might have been." "The alternative was survival," Vane said. "The alternative was ending a conflict that would have cost us far more lives if I had followed your careful, measured approach instead. You call what I did a failure. I call it the only decision anyone in that position could have made if they were willing to actually win instead of simply feeling righteous about losing slowly." I watched Daniel absorb this argument without flinching, without offering the kind of immediate, defensive rebuttal that anger might have demanded. Instead, he simply shook his head slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that seemed to unsettle Vane more than any counter-argument could have. "You have spent years convincing yourself that I betrayed you," Daniel said. "But I think, somewhere beneath all of that anger, you know the truth is simpler than that. You know what you did was wrong, and you have spent every year since then trying to build an entire philosophy around avoiding that truth, because the alternative is admitting that the people we lost on that colony did not have to die." Vane's expression cracked for just a moment, something raw and wounded flashing across his features before the coldness returned, sharper now, more brittle. "You do not get to lecture me about their deaths," he said. "You were not there in the final hour, Daniel. You were safely back at command, making decisions from a distance while I stood in the middle of it, watching everything fall apart in real time. It is easy to judge choices you never had to actually make." "You are right," Daniel said quietly, I was not there. And I have carried that absence as my own failure every single day since, wondering whether my presence might have changed what happened. But that guilt does not excuse what you chose to do, Vane. It never has. And building an entire organization around punishing me for holding you accountable will not change that either. For a long moment, neither man spoke, the tension between them stretching taut across the ridge like a wire pulled to its breaking point. I held my breath, watching, waiting for whatever would come next, uncertain whether this confrontation would resolve through words alone, or whether the volatile grievance simmering in Vane's posture would demand something more. It was Vane who finally broke the silence, his shoulders sagging slightly, the aggressive posture he had maintained since arriving on the ridge softening into something closer to exhaustion. I built this organization because I needed somewhere to put everything I could not put anywhere else, he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier bravado. Every soldier who joined me, every operation we conducted since, all of it was supposed to prove that my judgment on that colony was correct, that the ends justified whatever the cost turned out to be. And did it? Daniel asked gently. Did any of it actually prove what you needed it to prove? Vane did not answer immediately. He looked past Daniel, toward the horizon, toward the palace lights beginning to glow faintly in the gathering dusk, and something in his expression suggested a war being fought internally that none of us watching from the boundary line could fully witness. No, he admitted finally, so quietly that I barely caught the word carried on the evening wind. It never did. Every operation just left another debt I could not repay, another justification I needed to build, to keep myself from admitting the first one was already a mistake I could never undo. Above us, the 6 ships continued their slow, watchful circling, awaiting some signal from their commander that had not yet come, and, I began to hope, perhaps never would. Kessa's hand remained on her weapon, but I noticed her posture shifting slightly, the readiness for immediate confrontation, giving way to a more cautious, observant stillness, as she too sensed the confrontation on the ridge, moving toward a resolution none of us had fully anticipated. It does not have to continue this way, Daniel said, taking a single careful step closer to his former officer. Whatever debt you believe I owe you, Vane, I am not going to pay it through violence, and I do not believe you actually want that either. Not truly. I think you have been searching for an ending to this for as long as I have, and neither of us has known how to reach it without someone else forcing the decision. Vane looked at him for a long, searching moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, the last of his carefully constructed anger finally giving way to something closer to genuine grief, the kind that had clearly been buried beneath years of purposeful, weaponized bitterness. If I stand down now, he said slowly, if I call back my ships and walk away from this, what happens to everything I have built since? What happens to the people who followed me because they believed in what I was trying to prove? That depends entirely on what you choose to prove going forward, Daniel said. You can continue building an organization around old grievances and unresolved guilt, chasing a justification that will never fully satisfy you, no matter how many operations you conduct in its name. Or you can finally let this end here, on this ridge, and figure out what kind of life remains for you, once you stop trying to prove that the worst decision you ever made was somehow the right one. The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had preceded it, heavier with possibility rather than tension, and I found myself holding my breath again, watching for whatever Vane would choose in this final, fragile moment of decision. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and touched something at his collar, a small communication device I had not noticed before, and spoke a single word into it, quiet, but clear enough to carry across the evening air, toward where I stood. Stand down, he said, and above us, almost immediately, the 6 ships began to shift their formation, breaking away from their watchful circling and climbing steadily upward, retreating toward the darkening sky beyond our atmosphere. I released a breath I had not realized I was holding, watching the ships depart, watching the tension in Kessa's posture finally ease into something closer to relief. On the ridge, Daniel and Vane remained facing each other, the confrontation finally settling into something quieter, something closer to 2 old comrades finally acknowledging a wound that had festered for far too long between them. This does not undo what happened on that colony, Vane said finally, his voice carrying the exhausted weight of a man who had just set down a burden he had carried for years, without realizing how heavy it had truly become. It does not undo the years I spent building something around punishing you for holding me accountable." "No," Daniel agreed. "It does not undo any of it, but it can be the moment we both stop letting it define everything that comes after." "I am not offering you forgiveness I do not believe I have the right to give, Vane. I am offering you the chance to walk away from this and figure out what kind of person you want to become, now that the debt you believed you were owed no longer has to control every choice you make." Vane looked at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded, a small, tired gesture that carried more genuine emotion than anything else he had expressed since arriving in our skies. Without another word, he turned and began walking back down the far side of the ridge, toward wherever his own ship waited beyond our sight, leaving Daniel standing alone at the summit, silhouetted against the last fading light of the setting sun. I did not wait for Kessa's permission before urging my mount forward, crossing the distance toward the ridge as quickly as I dared, my heart still racing from everything I had just witnessed. Daniel turned as I approached, and the exhaustion in his expression finally gave way to something softer, something closer to relief, as I dismounted and closed the remaining distance between us. "Is it over?" I asked, searching his face for confirmation I desperately needed. "I do not know if it is entirely over," Daniel admitted. "Grievances, like his, do not simply disappear because of one conversation on a ridge. But I think, for tonight at least, your people are safe, and I think Vane finally found something he had been searching for, far longer than either of us realized." I stepped closer, wrapping my arms around him despite the dust and exhaustion clinging to both of us, and for a long moment we simply stood together on that quiet ridge, watching the last of Vane's ships disappear into the darkening sky, the weight of everything that had happened over the past week finally beginning to settle into something we could both, slowly, begin to process. "You could have told me all of this from the very beginning," I said softly, though there was no accusation left in my voice, only a lingering ache for the burden he had carried alone for so long. "You did not have to protect me from your past, Daniel. I would have understood." "I know that now," he said, holding me close. I think some part of me needed to believe I could simply leave that version of myself behind entirely. That gentleness alone could be enough to build a new life, without ever having to reckon with the person I used to be. I understand now that was never truly possible. Perhaps it was never even the right goal to begin with. Above us, the stars began to emerge one by one against the deepening night sky, and somewhere beyond that darkness, I knew, an old soldier was flying away from a confrontation that had defined years of his life, carrying with him whatever uncertain future awaited someone finally forced to let go of a grievance he had built his entire identity around. I did not know, standing there on that ridge, whether we had truly seen the last of Vane, but I understood, more clearly than I ever had before, exactly what kind of man I had married, and exactly how much courage it had taken him to finally let me see all of it. The weeks that followed Vane's departure brought a kind of quiet I had not expected to find on the other side of such turmoil, though it was not the same quiet that had defined the early months of my marriage. That earlier quiet had been built on ignorance, on my willingness to accept a simplified version of the man I had married, without asking the harder questions underneath it. This new quiet felt different, earned rather than assumed, built on the foundation of everything Daniel and I had finally laid bare between us. The palace itself returned gradually to its normal rhythms. Kessa's security teams stood down from their heightened alert status, though I noticed she never fully abandoned certain precautions Daniel had recommended during those tense days, incorporating several of his suggested improvements permanently into our standard defense protocols. When I asked her about it one afternoon, she simply shrugged in the manner of a career soldier who had learned to value good advice regardless of its source. "Your husband understands threats. Most of our tacticians have never had to consider," she said. "It would be foolish to discard that knowledge simply because the immediate danger has passed. I suspect it will not be the last time his particular expertise proves useful to this palace." Daniel himself settled into a new rhythm that bore little resemblance to the careful performance of harmlessness he had maintained during our first 6 months together. He no longer hid his morning walks around the perimeter, no longer pretended his questions about our defense systems stemmed from idle curiosity rather than genuine expertise. He began, at Kessa's quiet insistence, and eventually my own encouragement, working directly with our military advisors, not as a commanding presence trying to reclaim old glories, but as a consultant whose hard-won experience could help prevent the kind of vulnerabilities that had nearly cost us everything during Vane's second visit. He still visited the gardens, though less frequently than before, and I came to understand that this was not a retreat from who he truly was, but rather an integration of both halves of himself, the soldier and the gardener, existing together now rather than one carefully concealing the other. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I preferred this version of him entirely, not because the soldier was more impressive than the gentle husband I had first grown fond of, but because the wholeness of him, contradictions and all, felt more honest than the careful performance he had maintained before. My father's counsel, when they eventually learned a fuller version of events, though never the complete truth Daniel had shared with me privately, reacted with a mixture of alarm and grudging respect that mirrored my own initial journey through those difficult weeks. Several nobles who had once mocked my pet human, as they so dismissively called him, found themselves suddenly eager to seek his counsel on matters of security and strategy, a reversal that Daniel accepted with the same quiet humility he had always carried, neither seeking the newfound respect nor rejecting it when it was genuinely offered. I asked him once, several weeks after Vane's departure, whether he believed his former officer would ever return, whether the peace found on that ridge would truly hold against whatever grievances remained unresolved beneath the surface. "I do not know," Daniel admitted, and we were sitting together in the garden as the evening light softened around us, the same garden where he had once stood grieving among the flowers, before everything came to a head. I would like to believe he found something genuine that day, some willingness to finally let go of the anger he had carried for so long, but grief and guilt do not always resolve themselves so neatly, even when we desperately want them to. "And if he does return," I asked, "will you be ready?" Daniel considered the question for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried none of the fear I might have expected from that question weeks earlier, only a steady, quiet confidence born from having finally faced the thing he spent years running from, and discovering he could survive the confrontation without losing himself entirely in the process. "I will be ready," he said, "not because I want to be the person I was during that conflict again, but because I understand now that hiding from who I used to be was never actually protecting anyone. It was only delaying a reckoning that eventually found its way to my door, regardless of how carefully I tried to avoid it. Whatever comes next, Velara, I would rather face it honestly, with you beside me, than spend another 6 months pretending to be someone I am not." I thought often, in the months that followed, about that first morning on the balcony, watching my husband stare up at a sky that held answers I was not yet ready to understand, and about everything I had learned since then, about the true nature of harmlessness. I had once believed gentleness and strength existed in opposition to one another, that a soft-spoken man who tended flowers and apologized for stepping on someone's foot could not possibly carry within him the capacity for the quiet, devastating competence I had witnessed on that ridge. I understood now how wrong that assumption had been. Daniel's gentleness had never been the absence of strength. It had been strength deliberately restrained, a choice made and remade every single day, a discipline far more demanding than the reckless confidence Vane had once mistaken for true capability. The man who tended gardens and the man who commanded defenses were never truly separate people, only two expressions of the same deep well of character, one nurturing and patient, the other decisive and unyielding, both equally essential to understanding who my husband truly was. The Dominion's relationship with the human coalition deepened considerably in the months following Vane's departure, strengthened rather than weakened by the crisis we had weathered together. My father's counsel, initially skeptical of an alliance built around a marriage they viewed as merely convenient, began to understand something my own experience had already taught me directly, that the humans who arrived in our sector carrying themselves without the usual displays of aggressive posturing were not weak or unremarkable at all, but simply disciplined in ways my own people were only beginning to learn to recognize and respect. I never forgot the lesson that experience taught me, standing on that palace balcony in the cold morning air, watching my harmless husband transform into something far more complicated and far more remarkable than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. The galaxy, I came to understand, held few things more dangerous than a gentle soul who had chosen restraint, not from weakness, but from hard-won wisdom, and fewer things, still more worth treasuring, than a partner willing, eventually, to let you see every part of who they truly were, the soft and the steel both, woven together into something whole. Years later, when new threats eventually found their way to our doorstep, as they always seem to in a galaxy still adjusting to the presence of a species as quietly formidable as humanity had proven itself to be, I never again made the mistake of underestimating what lay beneath a calm exterior. I had learned, in the most personal way possible, exactly what my father's council had failed to understand when they first offered me this marriage as a simple political convenience. They believed they were securing an alliance with a species too new, too unproven, too soft in appearance to represent any true strategic value beyond the paper agreements binding our two peoples together. What they had actually secured, though none of them fully understood it until circumstances forced the truth into the open, was a partnership with a people who understood something my own warrior culture had never fully grasped. That true strength did not require constant demonstration. That the most capable individuals were often the ones who chose gentleness as a deliberate practice rather than an inherent limitation, and that the galaxy's nightmare, when it finally arrived in our skies aboard that single unmarked warship, had never actually been the enemy I initially feared. It had been the quiet, devastating realization that humanity's harmlessness was never anything other than a choice, offered freely and maintained deliberately, right up until the exact moment it was no longer the wisest choice to make.